Hello, and welcome again to Thursday Thoughts, in this case about Daniel and the incredible life he lived. If you've been with me already, you know that in chapter 1, we were introduced to this young man with sterling character, also to his 3 friends who are going to prove themselves to be men of character as well. And then in chapter 2, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar, that wicked pagan king, had a dream that basically came from God and allowed us to have a panorama of the Gentile kingdoms of the world before they ever developed or conquered a single city. We have noted that this statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in chapter 2 was huge because man always has an elevated view of his accomplishments. The Gentile kingdoms were represented by a head of gold, which Daniel explained to us represented Babylon, the arms and chest of silver, which we came to know was Medo-Persia, then the midsection and upper thighs of brass, which we learned is Greece, first started by Philip of Macedon, but really making a mark under his son, Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, we know it was divided into 4 parts. The generals who were in charge of those 4 quadrants just couldn't hold it together. And then along came the might and power of Rome, represented by iron on the statue, the 2 halves of that kingdom, obviously represented by the 2 legs. And then, though we did not discuss it very much, feet and toes of iron mixed with clay. Interestingly enough, Daniel, at the point of this interpretation, is not given much information about that kingdom. We know because of looking in retrospect and because of revealed prophecy that we will see later that that is the kingdom that the Antichrist will try to establish, a kingdom that will never gel because of the disunity, the disharmony, the unrest that will eventually lead to a civil war, but we will talk about that later. And then in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar II, saw this huge stone, not a brick, nothing man-made, that was cut out without hands, because we know this stone is representative of Jesus Christ and of the kingdom that one day he will establish. And in that dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw this stone crash into those feet and toes, and literally that statue disintegrates. It's demolished and turns into nothing but fine powder and dust, the kind that can be just blown away. Because, hear me, one day the best efforts of man, Gentile men particularly and women, will be destroyed because our efforts are never going to be enough, and they're never going to be based in God's plan for eternity. Jesus Christ will establish a kingdom that will last forever, and we will talk more about that as well when Daniel finishes interpreting the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. The king does something that seems strange to us, but not probably so much for his culture. He literally tries to worship this teenage boy and orders the same kind of sacrifice offered to him that would have been offered to one of his pagan gods. Of course, we know what Daniel would do, quickly refuse, because he always made sure that the glory and honor for anything that he accomplished went to God where it belonged. That's not the first time that, if you're a history buff, you will run into something like that. The story is told that Alexander the Great once bowed as if to worship a Jewish priest. One of his generals just really was highly offended at that, and Alexander said, well, I'm not bowing to this man. I'm bowing to the God he serves. And I just want you to know that probably on some level that may have been Nebuchadnezzar's ideology, but whether it was or not, I'm here to tell you that it still works today when we bow to the God who is the master of the universe. Daniel was immediately promoted, second highest position in the land. That's very important for us, especially as we are preparing to move into chapter 3. According to his character and the pattern that we've seen developed already, and a pattern that will continue, he immediately asked that his 3 friends, Hananiah, which we're going to hear called Shadrach from here on out, Mishael, who will be called Meshach, and Azariah, who will be called Abednego, were promoted to relatively high positions in the kingdom. But let me draw a line of distinction. Daniel was second highest in that court. So though they had a good position, not nearly the position that we're going to see them achieve as this book and its incredible stories move forward. Now, as I promised last week, we're going into chapter 3. This chapter is considerably different. Some have argued from the very beginning, because Daniel is not mentioned at all, that it's weird or strange, or where's Daniel? Why isn't Daniel a part of what's going on? Almost all Bible scholars believe that because of this high-ranking position, that Daniel is probably on a trip representing the king. Now, it's important for us to understand that most scholars believe that there's a 20-year gap between chapter 2 and chapter 3, meaning that there's been a good amount of time for Daniel to establish himself as an emissary for the king. So, as an ambassador for that kingdom, literally. So, I'm not at all concerned that he's not mentioned, and I'll tell you up front, had he been present with what was going on, I can tell you without any hesitation that he would have done what was right to honor God. So let's go ahead and establish that. This chapter is not going to talk about the man Daniel, and I do believe that that's a good reason for that. Now, when we ended chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar was raving about the God of all gods, the God of Daniel. In this 20-year gap, that fervor has cooled off some. And so now we're going to see that there seems to be a little bit of a shift in the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar II. Now, let's take up our reading in chapter 3, and you can read along with me in whatever version you have. I'm going to read the first 7 verses of chapter 3, and then we will pause for some comments. So follow along with me. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So, all of these invited officials, which I will not reread, it's the very same list, assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately," I'll emphasize that, immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard all of those instruments, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. We know that there's a contradiction to that statement. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Now, what do we know? Nebuchadnezzar has apparently decided that a statue of himself is worthy of worship. I think it would add some insight if we take a brief look at that statue. That statue was 90 feet tall and 9 feet broad or across. I'm actually reading NIV today for a reason, because it has done the work for us of translating ancient measurements into measurements that we can understand. Now, if you're thinking with me, 90 feet is very tall, 9 feet is not that broad. This statue is incredibly out of proportion. A normal human being is about, the proportion is not 10 to 1, it's about 5 to 1. So this is a skinny, tall statue. And it's a statue, we're told, of gold. Now hear me, Nebuchadnezzar is wealthy enough, and remember the gold that I said is associated with Babylon. He's wealthy enough for that statue to literally be totally made of gold. But most scholars believe that the statue was wooden overlaid with gold because it would have been incredibly difficult to mold a statue of that size of pure gold. So we've got this gargantuan statue on the plains of Dura, not far from Babylon. We don't know exactly where, but that's not really that relevant or important. And according to what we know, he has considered himself worthy of that kind of adulation and worship and adoration. Now, there are some things we need to understand here. Did you pay attention to the list of people who were invited? If you go back through there, it never says anything about Daniel, but every person who held a slightly lower but very important and prominent position in the kingdom is there. Some Bible scholars believe as many as 300,000 people could have been in that plain standing before that statue. That's a lot of people. In other words, from over his kingdom, the people who were directly under his authority, people whose allegiance he would fully demand and expect, were all there present. Part of me wonders if it wasn't a new way to demand their allegiance and to make sure that he had that. It was basically a long process. So we've got an orchestra. Now, whichever version you're reading, it may use slightly different names for some of those instruments. But it basically means that there are horns and there are stringed instruments and there are flutes. It's an ancient days orchestra. When the orchestra plays, it's kind of like when we have worship music and our hearts and our focus shifts toward God. He's got the same scenario. When the music plays, people were to bow before this statue, to bow down in obeisance. Now, interestingly enough, the list of those instruments, before we finish this chapter, that list is going to occur 4 times. The people who were invited are listed in verse 2 and instructed in verse 3. The demands are clear, the protocol is set, and when I ended our reading in verse 7, it says that everyone fell down. But let's go back to our reading now, starting at verse 8, and let's get some clarification on that. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. I hate to interrupt, but I have to stop right here. I need to remind you that Daniel and his friends were promoted probably above the majority of these guys. So there's likely some jealousy there, likely some cultural conflict there, but rooted in jealousy, no doubt. I also need to remind you that not a single one of these guys would probably be alive unless they're incredibly young, had it not been for Daniel. Do I need to remind you that they were all set to be killed until Daniel was able to interpret the king's dream? You know that you're doing the right thing when you do it for a person, whether they'll be grateful or not. So just bear that in mind. Verse 9. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever, fawning as all get out. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, hear the jealousy there, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Need you to hear something. There were 3 tiers to the accusation. They don't revere you the way they should. They don't pay attention to you like they should. They don't worship the same gods you worship. And you know what? That image you set up, they didn't bow down and worship it. Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue from my hand?" Whoa, right there. I can't help it. I have to stop. Notice what's going on here. There's this image. They're supposed to bow. I need you to hear me. From the very beginning, it's been Satan's agenda to get people to bow before someone or something other than the God who is worthy. I'll take you back to Matthew chapter 4 and remind you that Satan tempted Jesus after that 40-day period of fasting when his physical body was weak. And what was one of the things that he asked? He said, "Why don't you just bow down to me for just a second? That's all it'll take. And then I'll give you all these kingdoms of this world." And the response is that we're only to worship one, because there's only one who is or ever will be worthy, and that is the Lord our God. And so just as Jesus refused, we also need to be aware and take a stand and be on guard that Satan not tempt us and trip us up. 2 Corinthians 4:4 reminds us that Satan's the god of this age, that he blinds people, and that it's his agenda to distract our focus, to keep us from aligning ourselves with God, from worshiping only him. So here we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have refused to bow. They've taken a stand. They've done the right thing. But sometimes taking a stand, putting your trust in God, refusing to bow, comes with a fairly high price tag. There is no doubt that these men fully believed that Nebuchadnezzar would do what he's threatened. But there are some interesting things that are happening in just the few verses I've already read, even though I intended to go all the way to verse 30 before I stopped, but never mind. Anyway, we see here that out of this mass of people, 3 men, no telling how far away from this statue they actually were in this huge sea of people. I have to wonder if Nebuchadnezzar would have ever known they didn't bow if it weren't for these guys who tattled on them. Be that as it may, whatever that may mean, that 3-pronged accusation is in place, and Nebuchadnezzar is furious. It makes us understand clear that even though the word tells us that we are to pray for those who have rule over us in Romans 13, in 1 Timothy 2, in 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17, but our first duty, our primary allegiance is to God. We are to obey the laws of the land until they conflict with or until they divide us from those who will not worship our God. So we're to love God, the one true God, with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Obviously, these guys do that. If we love God that way, then we cannot bow down and give honor to any false god, any image that represents a god, or anyone who tries to distract us from God. Okay, So Nebuchadnezzar is in a rage. Now, I need you to know that I understand that maybe every word is not recorded here, but I find no record that these three men asked for a second chance. They didn't say, "Oh, king, why don't you just give us another chance? We might reconsider." Because the truth of the matter is, there's no need for a second chance for them. Because, see, their minds are already made up. They will not bow. The number of chances will not change that. So Nebuchadnezzar is talking about another opportunity for which they never ask. So he says, now look, when you hear the music, this time you guys bow down. Even though he's furious, part of me believes that there is something in him that still has some respect for them and no doubt for Daniel. So this second chance is being discussed, even though it was not requested at all. So he goes on, Nebuchadnezzar does, and he draws the line in the sand. This is how it's going to be, and this time you better do it because I'm powerful and I'm angry. No escape clause is included here. Not only that, the end of verse 15 is almost taunting. He says, look, if you don't worship, immediately you're going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. And then he says, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Hold on to that. That's almost taunting our sovereign and all-powerful God. So clearly, even with his interactions with Daniel, even seeing the character of these men now for probably close to 25 years, including the time they were in training, the time they initially stood before him for testing, and then probably at least 20 years of service. Okay. Beginning in verse 16 and going through at least verse 18, you have what I consider one of the greatest declarations of faith in Scripture. Some people want to interpret it the other way, as if there's a hinge in there that says there's a little doubt in God. I think it's exactly the opposite. Let's look at those verses. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, beginning verse 16, replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, notice, they start off saying, King, our God, he'll rescue us. He is powerful. He's able to do that. But then comes that little shift. But King, even if he doesn't, because our God's sovereign, he elevates and he takes down. If he does not choose to rescue us, it does not diminish or alter our reserve to serve only him. Our energies, our focus, our decision, our commitment is solid. We will serve him. We will not bow to any other, whether he rescues us or not. Now, here's where I think that's great faith. They believe God fully can rescue them. But whether he does or not, whether his plan for them in that life was finished, they knew that he was in charge. It would ultimately work out according to God's plan and will. And I say, God, help us to trust God for the miraculous, but to walk knowing that whether he delivers us from the valley or walks us through the valley, whether our time on this life ends or doesn't end when we think it should, God's plan and purpose, his sovereign will, his power will bring to pass what is good. It's not our job to question. It's our job to trust in faith and follow him, which these men do in an incredible fashion. Now, we can just about imagine this king, who's very accustomed to getting his way all the time, has been told no twice, basically. So see his reaction beginning in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. Hear that. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. So the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." Then he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. The 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces." Okay, his methods haven't changed. "And their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Okay, whoa. Furious, he says, "We're not only throwing these guys into a fiery furnace, we're going to heat it 7 times hotter." In other words, any sympathy he might have felt for them is long gone, and nothing but rage that is based in pride remains. Hear me, because that's exactly what it is. And so I'm guessing they had a way of pumping air into that fire, much like we would use a bellows or blow on a fire to get it going. And so now we have literally a raging inferno. The Bible doesn't exactly describe what the fiery furnace was like, but apparently it would have had to be stone. We believe that there was probably an opening in the top and some way, an elevation, so that men could be thrown over into this burning area, and apparently some sort of viewing area from the front so that people could see without being burned. So we're guessing that that's somewhat the setup that existed. So the best soldiers of the kingdom are now going to be used, strong men who are loyal to the king, to throw these 3 guys into this fire. The fire is so hot that the men who throw them in are killed. That's amazing, the danger and the risk level that existed there. These men fall. First of all, I want you to note, I don't know how far they fell, but the fall doesn't hurt them, because we then see them up walking around, and Nebuchadnezzar is counting. Hey guys, didn't we just throw 3 men down there? There were 3 men who didn't bow. He said, "Look, I see 4 men down there, and one of them looks like what? As if he was a son of the gods." Now, if you're reading the King James Version, it'll probably say the Son of God, but you need to hear me. Nebuchadnezzar still believes there are all kinds of gods. This Hebrew God's just kind of a special one amongst them. And so we don't for any reason believe that he would have recognized a pre-incarnate theophany of Jesus Christ at all. So obviously he knew that there was something supernatural happening. I don't know whether Jesus Christ was walking in that fire or whether he sent a mighty angel. It doesn't matter. Clearly, God sent divine intervention for the men who had taken a stand for him. These men who had totally and completely submitted their lives into God's hands. In fact, what they did is basically similar to what Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. It wouldn't have been their top preference to be thrown into a fiery furnace, but if that was God's will and plan for them, they were willing to do it. So here, Nebuchadnezzar's questioning a whole lot more than a head count. He is recognizing divine intervention when it occurs. Now notice, when these guys are called to come forth out of this fire, and apparently they were able to do that, to walk out some sort of way, however that worked. They not only weren't burned, their clothes weren't singed, their hair wasn't singed, they didn't smell like smoke. The only thing that had changed about them, even though they went in fully clothed, was the ropes that had bound them were burned off and they had been set free. I need you to hear me. The only part about those young men that was Babylonian were those ropes that had been used to tie them up, and that part was gone. So these men who had tattled are now the witnesses to the divine deliverance of a holy God, the divine faithful intervention of God in behalf of the men who had been so faithful to him. Now, hear me. These men meant it for evil, but God turned the evil intentions of jealous-hearted men into another opportunity for promotion for the men who had been faithful. There are lessons here for us, no doubt. Sometimes life throws hard challenges. Sometimes there are people who don't understand when we take a stand for God. Sometimes there are things that we don't understand that come into our path that make no sense to us. But when we stand for God and we stand for right, He will stand for us. Our response to trials, our response to challenges should be faith in the God who's always faithful. So we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are being promoted again. We see that God continues to elevate them in the kingdom, not to the level of Daniel, but obviously what they've done has been rewarded. Now, we don't always get a big promotion when we do what's right, so let me make this clear. Knowing that you have taken a stand for right is reward in and of itself, and God keeps perfect records. Hear me. Whether you see the benefit of that in this life ever or not, there is one day when wrongs will be made right and rewards that are appropriate will be dispensed, and I believe that with my whole heart. Now, I remind you again, Daniel is not mentioned, but had he been present, we already know he never would have bowed to that statue, to that elevated example of pride. And hear me, pride is going to continue to be an issue. This statue gives us a foreshadowing of the issue that's going to be Nebuchadnezzar's undoing, at least temporarily. I've made the statement before and I'll make it again. At the foundation of all sin, there is some element of pride. On some level, we believe we're above God's laws, or for those moments in time, what we want ought to be more important than what God has planned and what He desires. So that pride that we saw in a man who would build a statue 90 feet tall covered with gold for himself is going to come really into play in chapter 4. There's a pretty good chance that about 10 more years have passed. In this instance, Daniel is back in the courtroom where we expect him to be. The content of this chapter is completely unrelated to the chapter that precedes it or follows it. It's very different, in fact, because Nebuchadnezzar writes this chapter. He speaks in first person. Clearly, Daniel includes this chapter in his book because of the incredible lesson that it teaches. And I'll be honest, this chapter should serve as a very poignant warning to us because God's greatness and power are obvious and not disputable. And when our pride refuses to allow ourselves to be humble before Him, then the book of Proverbs makes it clear that destruction and a fall are in our path. So that's basically what we're going to see here as we read this introduction and get the feeling that Nebuchadnezzar is communicating with the nations of the known world in his day. I'm in chapter 4, and we will look at the first 3 verses just as an introduction. King Nebuchadnezzar to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world. Clearly, it's a legal document or it's an official letter. May you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are His signs, how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. Now, I need to clarify something. Even though he extols the power and divine intervention of God, we cannot assume here that that means that he is committed to the one true God and that he does not still worship idols. He's just finally figured out who is the supreme power in what is probably a collection of gods for him. Do note, though, that this communication would have been dispersed across the known world in this particular time. And so he has shared that the content is in some way positive, but we're going to see that it doesn't start off positive. And it's a good thing that where he's concerned that God is a merciful God. And I might add, it's a good thing he's a merciful God where we're concerned as well. Let me read the gist. He's going to have a second dream. This dream is not a secret. The content of it is going to be known from the beginning and shared with the wise men. So this is not about that kind of experience, but it is about God giving a pagan king a warning and then a full year to do something about that warning, which he ignored. I'll come back to that later. Chapter 4, beginning at verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. Whoa. I cannot read past that. I apologize. He was what? He was contented and prosperous. He wasn't in a battle with any foreign enemy. He wasn't afraid that someone in his court was about to poison him, which those kinds of things happened all the time. He was at rest and contented. Sometimes we get careless and negligent when things are going too well. That's exactly what's going on here. Verse 5, I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. I made a statement earlier that nothing seemed to scare this wicked king except his own dreams. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Now, the statement that I just read that he called all the wise men isn't true, is it? Because we see in verse 8, finally Daniel came to my presence and I told him the dream. He does not remember very well, or he would have called Daniel first. He is called Belteshazzar after the name of my God. You remember what I said in the opening? That he's not now a worshiper only of the true God. He's still acknowledging these other gods that he worships. And the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. Everything about Nebuchadnezzar is enormous. Can you say inflated ego? The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it, the beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it, every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger. Now, it's called, depending on the version you read, it may say watcher, it may say holy one. A holy one coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High, here's that theme of the book again, is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of men. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, we would prefer to call him Daniel, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. I remind you of what I said a few moments ago about pride. Now, the book of Proverbs, chapter 6, verses 16 to 19, tell us that the Lord hates some things, that 7 are an abomination to him. He hates a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. I didn't write it, and so I didn't stutter reading it. There are some things that God just does not tolerate very well, and certainly are sinful things. And so here, this king, who is guilty of the sin of pride. David Jeremiah describes pride as an exaggerated and dishonest self-evaluation, and I think I agree with him. And so here, he's had this dream. He clearly tells Daniel all that's included in the dream, and he, in no uncertain terms, describes the size, the impact of this tree that he sees, and then what happens at the end when the vision of this tree is interrupted by this proclamation. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is guilty of crediting himself with everything he's accomplished. That's dangerous, because every gift we have, every good thing we accomplish, is because God has He is the one who gives us. He is the one who enables us. So Nebuchadnezzar has followed his normal pattern. He calls for the wise men, who are not very wise, and then he wises up and calls for Daniel, who he says himself, I know you can interpret it. It does make one wonder why he would call people he doesn't fully trust to give him the information he needs before he calls the one man he knows can help him. Now, Daniel not only is summoned and touted as the one who can interpret the dream, but he clearly has that gift from God that's already been well established, and he's the chief of the magicians. Do you notice that? It's clear that he's their superior because of the Spirit of God within him. Now, Nebuchadnezzar explains the whole parts of the dream, two parts, and Daniel is going to give him the significance of those parts. Let's look at a little bit of that expanded so that we'll have a good feel for what's intended here. The tree was where? It was in the middle of the earth. So it was strategically located so that the kingdoms of the earth were spread out around this tree. It grew and became strong. Remember, I told you that the transition of these kingdoms on this statue didn't happen in a week, because gradually areas and territories would have to be conquered. And Babylon, every kingdom as we move down that statue includes more territory. They expand and become larger. So they may be spread out, cover more territory, but there's still Gentile kingdom efforts to do what only Jesus Christ is ultimately going to be able to do, and that is rule the world. Now, the tree was so tall it reached up into the heavens. And there's an implication there. I'll leave you to your imagination with that one. It could be seen all over the known world, suggesting influence, suggesting power and control. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit was abundant, it was productive, it had a great deal to do with the provision for the known world. It provided food for all, so it nourished. Notice both animals and people alike. The beasts of the field found shade under it. It had branches that the birds of the heavens could dwell in. Again, notice the vast influence there. So as we start to look at the significance of this dream, it's important to remember that the image of a tree in Scripture is not an isolated image. It occurs in a lot of places, and it's typically symbolic. We see it in 2 Kings 14, in Psalm 1, representing the righteous man who's like a tree planted by the rivers of water. Also in Psalm 37, Psalm 52, Psalm 92, Ezekiel 17, Mark 13. It's a very common theme. So this idea of a tree and whether or not it flourishes or is cut off is huge. Also, the idea of the stump being left is very significant, because you may trim your bushes or your hedges and you may cut them back very close, but as long as there's a healthy root, that bush or that tree or that hedge will grow back. So we need to recognize that and how important that is as well. Now, verse 17 seems to suggest that the content of the dream is going to come to pass because there is a specific purpose. You heard the words of the watcher, the shared future that's going to happen. The tree's going to be cut off, but band up the stump. 7 years, that's what we know that time frame to be, are going to pass. And you see that what's going to happen, the time frame for it, the impact of it, is all clear here. Let me begin reading in verse 19, and let's see how Daniel's going to share this information with this king. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. Now, I need to be clear here. Daniel is not confused or concerned or alarmed because he doesn't know what the dream means. He's alarmed because he's about to share with the king that something very devastating and negative is in his future and that it's ordained by God. Notice what he says, King, I wish what I now know would apply to your enemies and not to you. So obviously, even though it's a pagan king, even though he's mean-spirited in so many ways, Daniel has some loyalty for him. Paul writes in the New Testament that even if we are under someone's authority who's not kind, the way we conduct ourselves is still either God-honoring or it's not. And so here there's a certain amount of allegiance, a certain amount of respect for the position he holds, even if there's not respect for the man himself. Okay, verse 20, Daniel is going to share. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the beasts of the field, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds of the air. You, O king, are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. You, O king, saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump, bound with iron and bronze, in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live like the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High. The Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. Okay, so Daniel says, look, king, this is how it is. The tree's you. You are powerful. You are influential. You are the source of provision. Your kingdom rotates around you. You impact the known world. You're an important fella. But God has decided some things. Now notice, whether it's the watcher, the messenger, the Holy One, whichever your version calls it. Likely this is an angelic message. If you have trouble believing that can happen, flip over to the book of Revelation and read some, and you will see that that is not a stretch by any means. And so this is the message that's been shared. God has already decided it is going to happen. You are going to be driven from a sane, dignified, logical world and end up living like an animal for 7 years. And here's the criteria, King. That's how you're going to be until you acknowledge that God is sovereign and He's the one that rules. He's the one that is over the kingdoms and the kings of this world. He does give Nebuchadnezzar the hope. The stump's going to be left, and your kingdom is going to be preserved. And you need to hear me. To promise a king that his kingdom will be preserved for 7 years while he lives like he is an animal would be unheard of, unimaginable, with all of the intrigue and killing family members and doing whatever had to happen for people to seize power and crawl up on a throne to rule. It's not even feasible or comprehensible to believe that that would happen. Daniel tacks on a warning. King, if you change your ways, if you stop being prideful, if you start being kind, if you stop mistreating people, then God might relent, and this might not play out, or it might be further down the road. We already know that Nebuchadnezzar does not listen. It's a full year later, after this prophecy, a very specific prophecy. And we're going to see the fulfillment that comes. Let's begin our reading in verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He said, excuse me, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? The words were still on his lips. Still on his lips. When a voice came from heaven, this is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. Hold on right there. A couple of things. Nebuchadnezzar is walking and looking out over Babylon. I need you to understand me. In his day and age, there was nothing like Babylon. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were one of the 7 wonders of the world. He had built those because his wife, who was not from the area, was missing home, and so he had them built to comfort her, to provide beauty in her life. And so he's looking out over the city where he resides and the center of his rule, and he is patting himself on the back. Look what I have done. Look what I have accomplished. The words are still in his mouth and on his lips when that voice comes from heaven again saying, time's up. Everything that's been predicted for you is about to happen. It's a done deal. It's going to be fulfilled. You're going to be driven away from people. You're going to end up eating grass like cattle. Now, notice it says he was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Now, smart people, whoever those are, have tried to figure out how on earth that could happen. Some people think that he just simply was mentally ill, and there is a condition called lycanthropy, and it comes from the Greek word leukos, which means wolf, and the word anthropos, which means man. So this would be a mental illness where human beings actually believe they become a non-human animal. So he's living out in the fields. I don't know if it's because he's got just a mental illness or if it's because his body actually changes, but I will tell you that through the course of living in the fields like an animal, his body changed. He became very different. He ate like an animal. He lived like an animal. And so in behavior and in appearance, over that 7-year period, it's unlikely that we would have recognized him at all. we will stop here for now. Next week, we will tie up the loose ends of chapter 4 and go into chapter 5. I look forward to seeing you then. Be blessed.